Another serious inherited disease in our ancient legal system is the concept of precedent. Deeply rooted in our cursed class system, this principle states that judgments made in a high court of law are binding on any similar cases that appear in the future in any lower court. This sets up the basis for three of the greatest abuses of our legal system: its phenomenal cost, the appalling length of time taken to reach a decision, and the removal of decision-making powers of common people. The way this works in practice is that decisions made in so-called higher courts become binding on similar cases heard in so-called lower courts, such as employment tribunals, say. So if an employment tribunal hears a case where a decision made on a similar case in an appeal court ruled in one way, the tribunal has no choice but to apply the appeal court ruling, irrespective of how perverse that may be, forcing the wrong party to continue appealing through the layers of legal bureaucracy until such time as it reaches a court high enough to overturn the appeal court ruling. In other words, the employment tribunal is not allowed to examine the justice of the specific case before it, but must decide according to previous case histories from higher courts, functioning as a completely unnecessary layer of legal bureaucracy and rendering the existence of employment tribunals useless, except, of course, to the legal profession itself. Precedent was obviously designed mainly to establish a hierarchical control structure of the legal system. Many would argue that the purpose of precedent is to create uniformity of justice. But that view is clearly mistaken, firstly because the history of justice is so full of examples of gross injustice that it's quite difficult to believe that the law has ever been intended to serve justice, and certainly no evidence that precedent per se is responsible for whatever justice may occasionally have happened. And secondly, the law itself should be the device which should create uniformity of justice. The use of precedent as a binding instrument for how any particular law must be interpreted eliminates the ability of many courts to examine each and every case before them in the light of their unique circumstances. Precedent is used as one of the essential components of the bureaucracy of the law and ensures that lawyers and law enforcers have guaranteed employment. It has very little to do with providing justice for ordinary people. Whilst it's perfectly reasonable for lawyers to use legal arguments that have been heard before, if there's any relevance in merit in so doing, it is, however, clearly wrong that decisions made in previous court cases should be automatically binding on all similar cases in the future, and used as a tool to ride roughshod over tribunals and juries. The length of time taken by a court procedure is, like almost everything else connected with the law, designed to produce wealth for the legal industry, or sometimes to delay politically sensitive information from reaching the public domain until the guilty have died from old age and the public are past caring, or both. When trials of wealthy people or organizations occur, the proceedings can be made to last for months or even years. However, when poor people are in the dock, the whole job can somehow be wrapped up within an hour or two. This situation has evolved over many centuries, and the following example, taken from the introduction to Dickens' Bleak House, is very instructive. Inheritance law was the big money spinner of Dickens' day. The Jarndyce suit, the main subject of the Bleak House, had its parallels in several notorious cases known to Dickens, notably the Day case, dating from 1834, which had involved anything from 17 to 40 lawyers at any one point, and was still unsettled with accrued costs of £70,000, as Dickens wrote, around 1852, and the Jenkins case, which dated from 1798, and was spun out over 80 years until 1878, with costs of £250,000. And remember, that was in the 19th century, when ordinary people had to survive on incomes of less than £15 a year, if they were lucky. The practice of making fortunes out of the law, while still evading justice, is still very much alive and well. On January the 30th, 1972, for example, 14 unarmed people were gunned down by British troops in Derry. A hastily convened inquiry lasted 11 weeks and naturally exonerated the killers. However, many people were outraged that a major injustice had been done and pressed for another inquiry. Eventually, 27 years later, the Savile inquiry began. It took 7 years to ask its questions. 10 years after it began, and almost 40 years after the incident itself, the report had still not been completed. In November 2008, a report in the Times quoted Lord Savile, then 72, as being extremely sorry his report was taking so long, but that we will finish it. The estimated cost to the taxpayer of this fine example of British justice? £182 million. Almost without doubt, one feels that if the true story is ever eventually known, the pertinent evidence will be contained within no more than 2 sides of writing paper. But so effective is the system of protecting the guilty and fleecing the taxpayer in order to enrich the legal profession that it takes at least half a century to produce a report, and costs amounting to a king's ransom. Because providing security is the first duty of government, this yawning chasm that exists between the law and justice is an outrage. Today, many of our laws and the policing of those laws are clearly intended to generate revenue for the government to squander. The use of speed cameras, for example, to extort money from motorists is of course widely known, but there are plenty of other ways the legal system is exploited by its own practitioners to produce income for themselves. For example, in 2006, 3 pubs in Bingham, a small town in Nottinghamshire, were visited by 3 plainclothes police officers and a 14-year-old youth. The youth was instructed by the police to try to buy alcohol from the publicans at each of the pubs, even though selling alcohol to a 14-year-old is illegal. When the youth was served, the police promptly issued £80 fines to each of the licensees. This in a county which, at the time, possibly had the greatest incidence of gun crime in England. How can a police force presiding over an area infested with so much violent crime possibly justify wasting the time of its officers by having them use children to commit trivial offences, to entrap people, if not for the purpose of making money? We have an automated police system that's instantly available for pursuing any motorist who might break the speed limit, where hefty fines might be obtained, whilst people routinely endure petty and even violent crime without receiving any attention at all from the authorities. In 2005, for example, shopkeepers in Bournemouth were written to by the police, asking them not to bother reporting theft of goods less than £75 in value. Examples of other injustices, which are of no interest to the authorities, include violations of rights in the workplace, breach of contracts with self-employed workers or other small businesses, frequently resulting in the closure of the small trader, and the ducking and diving routinely practiced by large public and private organisations in order to avoid paying benefits or delivering services that people have paid for. Once again, it is not beyond the wit of man to eliminate many of these problems. It simply doesn't suit those who most benefit from the systemic injustice, the 1%, to do so. So although the British system of justice might be relatively good to Saudi Arabia, say, or Burma, it's a very long way from being as good as it could be, and radical change is long overdue. Most of this talk is concentrated on the many abuses of what passes for justice in Britain, which is supposed to be a relatively civilised and humane society. I haven't ventured into the murky world of injustice in international law or discussed the many other governments which are even more tyrannical than ours is. But the fact of all these other abuses of the principle of justice must not be overlooked or ignored. From the unspeakably appalling human and animal rights abuses in third world countries to the cynical injustice of the hallowed marbled courtrooms of the First World, from the outrageous manipulation of the global economy by imperial-controlled institutions such as the UN, IMF and World Bank, to the most obscene abomination human beings are capable of perpetrating, permanent war. The evidence for the non-existence of justice on a truly global scale is abundant and compelling. We need laws that protect ordinary citizens not only from criminals and the willful negligence of others, but also from the cynical abuses and excesses of our own trusted leaders. We do not need laws that pretend to protect people, but whose real function is increasing the security, power and enrichment of the 1%. This ancient and well-established practice of state persecution of basically law-abiding citizens in order to protect and enrich elites must be scrapped. People have lost trust and confidence in our law enforcers, and until that trust is created, the situation can only get worse. The legal system has been at war with justice for centuries, and this war has just about returned to the desperate days of the so-called Industrial Revolution. Real justice is what ordinary people, properly informed, say it is. It is that simple. This is not complicated or mysterious. The concept of justice is not some universal concept, like gravity, say. It's an entirely human construction. Therefore, only human beings can determine what it is. The legal system has always been controlled by the rich and powerful, the 1%. The legal system, which serves the 1%, has very little to do with justice, which is supposed to serve everyone. And whenever justice conflicts with the legal system always wins. Justice is the property of the people, therefore only the people, properly informed, should manage and administer it, not the super rich. Until our legal system accurately reflects this truth and subordinates itself to the management and administration of the people, justice will not exist. The legal system must cease to be used as a weapon for plutocrats to plunder the poor and become what it's supposed to be, a tool for providing real justice. There's a very long way to go.